Okay, and we're live. This is Deacon Joseph Swaden,
It's Bishop Enoch.
and this is Orthodox Apologetics Live. Hope everyone is having a productive fast and a useful one. And we're going to we're doing a quick show on a couple of things, so we will take questions and comments. I'm gonna just a couple of things that were of note in the past few days. And this is part of why we're doing this show. The first one we're going to talk about is a newly translated book that by Fr Theodore Zisis. It showed up. He's a conservative New Calendar priest. Who is he defrocked or not defrocked? I don't know his actual status at this point, Felica.
I think he was suspended because remember he lived in Thessalonica.
Right.
In northern Greece is technically the New Calendars in northern Greece are under the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and I think he refused to commemorate Bartholomew, and they back in 2016 or so, and they suspended him.
Right.
I don't know at what this point what the other situation is with him. The book though was written back in 2005. And it was translated only recently, I guess, for the one that's run by
the Russian, the Russian Faith website. I'm gonna put up the thingamabob as soon as I can figure out exactly how to do that. So give me just a moment while I do that, and I'm gonna just and we'll just put that there. And yep. Okay, so now you can see it on the screen there. This is from the Russian Faith website, as mentioned by Father Joseph Gleason. That's was he MP Rokor? He was one of the Russian jurisdictions, and he moved over to Russia with his whole family, and basically said goodbye to America. Yeah, it was in the Crete days. Thank you, Sean. And so this book is interesting. I mean, the first chapter, I think I mentioned this to you, Vladika, because you're the one who sent this to me. And the first chapter, I noticed he starts talking about the rise of homosexuality in the World Orthodox churches, and that bothers me because of the fact that it really puts you even though it is obviously wrong, and if they're blessing it, it's heretical. But if they're not blessing it, then technically it turns it into a Donatist argument. So in a sense, he says a lot of things like us, but then by bringing that up, it becomes almost a straw man for what we believe.
Yeah, well, I think his argument is that if the bishop lives in a moral lifestyle publicly, or at least is accused of it, the context behind this was that there were several revelations. I actually remember when this happened back in 2003 to 5. I mean, I wasn't in Greece, but even though I was inquiring into Orthodox at the time, I remember when this all happened. Mm-hmm. That there were several bishops in the New Calendar Church in Greece that were exposed as having affairs with women. That was the stuff that wasn't that so bad. There were others that were exposed of having, I guess, homosexual partners or something, that kind of crazy, even worse stuff than that. And so that's what precipitated, I think, this book. I think the problem is that he's describing the situation as so bad. It's so terrible that they have nobody. He says there are no bishops in Greece, he says, standing up against any of this. So his issue is that you have to do something, and you can cease commemoration of your bishop if they are involved in deposable crimes. The problem, however, is if you look now in the text of the book, if you read the 4 translated chapters, now I don't know if he addresses in other sections that aren't translated.
I think this is the whole book, actually.
Okay, so I've looked at all the chapters, all those translated sections. The problem is he doesn't really address, as I recall, I could be forgetting it, Canon 15 of the First Second Synod, which is the cornerstone of Orthodox theology of resistance to heresy when it comes into prominence in an official church body.
Right.
And that canon actually states, and so does Canon 14 and 13, I believe the previous ones, that the reason you cease commemoration of your bishop or a bishop of his metropolitan and a metropolitan of his patriarch is if they are teaching bareheadedly, that is publicly, heresy that has been condemned by the Holy Fathers or the Holy Councils. It says for other offenses, you should wait until there is a council gathered to judge them on the matter. But, it could be that, again, Father, this situation is so absolutely crazy over there. I mean, I'm not a New Calendarist in Greece. I don't know all the stuff going on, that they're resorting to this, saying you don't have to commemorate immoral bishops, So what do you think, Father?
Well, I mean, ultimately, if you look in the last chapter, which is what he's talking about, is that he's basically saying that you don't need permission to denounce ecumenism and to leave. Well, then what's wrong with us? Because that's our position. The point is, there's no reason to hold this position. Now, I've heard the argument. We'll get into that because in the second topic that we're talking about was just jurisdiction hunting, and ultimately. You can do that. Much of a shock now because we live in an age of mass communications. If it's now like if you can look at Archbishop Papadopoulos of the U.S. and you just look at his Twitter feed, and he's telling everyone not to go to church. Then he shows up at random political protests with a mask on,
or ecumenical events.
Yeah, and ecumenical events, but then, people can't even receive communion while he's wishing people a happy Ramadan on Twitter. And so, I shall once again toot my own horn, and yes, I was blocked by him. But now that's a really common occurrence. A lot of people are getting blocked by him because, if you dare to say something like, why can't you stand up for the faith? Boom, you're blocked. And so this is, this sort of childish behavior, which is something you would expect, from a keyboard warrior, not an archbishop of the church, is shocking. It sends a message like, whoa, this is kind of crazy. And I think in a sense, you could say that the coronavirus, kind of, really did some thrashing. In the U.S. because a lot of them Orthodox American converts are like, they're horrified. So this is for us, it's like a great wake up call. So I think it's interesting that they put this book up. Now you said this book's a few years old, Boudicca.
Yeah, it was actually translated in 2005 because it comes on the heels of the big sexual scandals that happened in Greece in 2003, 2005. Okay. And that's the context of it.
Well, I just think it's odd because it was translated like last week? Or put on the website last week, or the night it was put on Friday. So the point is that this is like being like treated. I mean, obviously we're in, ecumenism has not gone away and it's still in existence, so it's still relevant to them. But the question is, why now? And the only answer I have that I can see is because they really, really want things to work. And, a lot of people are asking some seriously, making some very good points in the chat, because, it's interesting because it will dovetail directly into what I was talking about with jurisdiction hunting in this video that David the Real Med White made, where he throws pot shots at us. But it comes up because he started the video by defending Father Peter Hears, and everyone is talking about Father Peter Hears in the chat. So, I'm going to go through a couple of the quick questions so we can do that real fast. Okay, so Sean's first thing says, okay, question. Should we take Father Theodore seriously? How bad can he hate us that he'd rather be alone and defrocked? Now, I think we were talking about this a little bit. We've been talking about this a little bit a couple of minutes before the show. That one of the problems is that if, Sean, I forget how long you've been in True Orthodoxy, but I do remember when I first came in, that while there were very good and sane and noble people in True Orthodoxy, there were also a lot of crackpots. And so, unfortunately, Father Theodore in Greece would have probably met at least a couple of those crackpots. And these things do have psychological effects on people. And unfortunately...
There were also significant scandals in Thessalonica in the late 80s and the early 90s, and they all calendarists. So that a lot of people who were sympathetic to them, who would have said, I agree with what they say. I remember we had a Father Paisius who died years ago, and he had went to theological school in Thessalonica back in the late 70s, early 80s, and he kind of talked about this.
Is that our Father Paisius who used to come to our house?
And Father Paisius said that it just made people who would have otherwise agreed with him. It just made a bad impression on people. So there's a distinction where you can have True Orthodox make the correct theological arguments. All right, you read a book by them, and it's like, we agree with that. But then what happens is the failure to present what you might consider a practical alternative. Now, obviously, you should you should still push through, and we encourage people to push through all the garbage that's always put there and such.
Well, it's gotten a lot better too. We're much better organized.
It's better than it was 30 years ago.
Yeah, day and night. It's completely different. But the point is, Father Theodore is an older man, so maybe he's just relying off his own memories and his own thoughts. That could be the main motivation, I would think. We could go the more conspiratorial route and assume that he's actually a secret plant, but we're not going to. I don't know if you really want to address that idea, but
there's really no. That's just speculation. So
yeah, it really is. Okay, so now Sean and Catacomb Orthodoxy both mentioned Father Peter Hears. Is anyone taking bets on how long before Father Peter Hears becomes true Orthodox? Isn't he almost out of jurisdictions to try? And Catacomb Orthodoxy responded with, no one knows what world Orthodox jurisdiction Father Peter Hears is in or under, and no one has wanted to try to claim him as their own. So I suspect it wouldn't be too long before he becomes true Orthodox. I'm not sure about that. I'm pretty sure he went to ROCOR, MP. I believe he was employed by their seminary. Unless something new has changed, or I'm not aware of it. But.
Well, all I know, and we don't want to talk too much about personalities. We are talking about Fr Theodore Zisis because he wrote this because his book is translated.
Right.
But in terms of Father Peter Hears, all I know is just from what's public, and that's he was part of ROCOR. He did leave the Ecumenical Patriarchate. He did move back to Greece, but he's living in northern Greece, so he could still be under the ROCOR MP in northern Greece. So who knows?
That would be a very unique situation.
Because remember, the Moscow Patriarchate is not in communion with the Ecumenical Patriarchate, which means Greece is out of the question. So
yeah. So
anyway,
so basically, I don't know what to say about that because he's, Father Peter is a very unique person, and he knows a lot about us. Not just us personally, but the true Orthodox movements in general. He knows about our jurisdictions. He does actually know about us, and he's usually quite polite in any discussion I've had with him. But it just shows he's really more of an example of the difficulty one has to go through just to try to preach the faith correctly. And so,
well, the other issue that's come about is several figures that are declared saints that these people venerate that we don't, and that shows a widening gulf. Where it's, for example, the question about Father Porphyrius of Mount Athos, Father Paisius of Mount Athos, and things like that.
Well, this is an interesting case because this actually, there was a bit of a Twitter fight I had because somebody put up some quote from Elder Paisios, which was basically kind of a anti-thinking quote, like thoughts are bad, something to that effect. And I don't mean like wayward thoughts or, in the sense you hear the Desert Fathers. It was just more like, thoughts are by themselves are evil. And that doesn't make any sense. And so I basically said I consider that suspect. So a couple people blocked me and they were mad at me for saying that. But then my wife actually decided, because she thought that just sounded so odd, to look it up and see if she could find that in any official documentation. And you can. Because there's also a big folk cultus around these people in Greece. And so some of the stuff that's attributed to them isn't even what they said.
Yeah,
and that makes it even harder. And then you have the weird cases like the Matthewite saint, the nun Myrtidisa, I think it is, and she was a Matthewite nun. The EP glorified her as a laywoman. It's like nonsensical. It's really weird, but they're trying to make sense of things. But it is weird that there is a widening gulf. I do agree with you there. And the question is, how does it get resolved? I still have no idea. But we carry on.
Okay.
And so let's see here. It does look like I think that's most of the questions. Mostly people are commenting on Father Peter and Father Josiah Trenum, who I guess people. It would be nice if they became true Orthodox, and they're always welcome to. But.
Well, just to conclude, if people are interested, they can look at the link and read Father Theodore's translated book. It's interesting just to understand what a conservative fighting from within person back in 2005, and now, I believe he has actually mentioned Canon 15 because there was during the Council Creep documents when they were being issued, there were several videos on YouTube. They may still be there that have translated subtitles where he did reference Canon 15. And that's what caused him to invoke the fact that he did not want to commemorate Bartholomew anymore.
Right.
And people began to ask him and others gradually about the old calendars, and they kind of had a non-committal answer. Not in the sense they were going to join them, but it was more or less, well, they're too extreme on some positions and such. For example, there was a Father Savas, I think, of the Holy Mountain, who was very negative toward all the Greek old calendars initially, but as the Council of Crete stuff dragged on and he went to Romania, he became they more or less adopted what you might call kind of a quasi-Cyprianite position. I don't know how you define it, where they didn't want to condemn people like us, but they didn't want to commend everything we said, because they kind of knew their position was one in which it would be ridiculous to say, look, there are these guys writing material for 60 years that essentially confirms what we've only discovered in the past 7 or 8 years. And for us to just say they're all garbage and we're the true leaders now. Yeah. But they never wanted to guide people that way, but they didn't necessarily condemn you if you did. And they adopted a position, I think, at one point, not Zisis, but these others, where they would talk to you and maybe there can be some agreement. But the problem is that boat has sailed for most of once the Cyprianites basically disbanded, and technically they had to deny their forming ecclesiology. At least I understand that's what had to happen. At least I understand that kind of boat of what would happen. I mean, that the one group that they could have actually joined basically moved on from that position. In other words, if you know what I mean.
Now, somebody did ask, why do you not recognize some of the people you mentioned? Some of these, I assume these these Athonite fathers that were glorified by the EP. And I basically I wrote back, we're not saying that because we don't recognize the EP's glorification. It's important to recognize that a glorification recognizes that a saint is a saint. Since we don't trust the EP ecclesiologically, we can't expect that their judgments are going to be correct. In the same way we didn't trust 12th century Roman Catholic canonization, so on and so forth. All I can say is that my answer is very agnostic. I have not investigated their lives. I don't know that I can recognize the EP's glorification. That's all I have to say on the matter.
Yeah, I mean, for example, if you come up with a case and they're attacking us and condemning and anathematizing us, then obviously we can't recognize them. But if it's a case where no one really knows what they believed, now in the case of Elder Paisius, Elder Savas of the Holy Mountain did actually write something against things he was saying. That actually does exist.
Okay.
So there is more of an issue with him, and some of the consideration goes into the fact that I think, at least in the case of Father Paisius, Encepetus, and maybe Porphyrius, one or both of them may have actually been old calendars at one point.
Yeah.
And then they were convinced to kind of become non-commemorators. And then they kind of supposedly Patriarch Demetrius said, well, no, I'm against ecumenism and we're moving back in a good direction. And they just, okay, I guess that's true. So what happens is that the Phaner would want to canonize people that basically they cajoled over decades or maybe lied to join them.
Now, it's worth noting that, let's say, for example, and this is, again, completely hypothetical, probably not going to happen, almost definitely not going to happen. But let's say they all condemned ecumenism tomorrow, right? And so they all condemn ecumenism. They all repent of their modernism. They all go back to the old calendar. I realize this is I'm making it as ridiculous as possible because I want to make very clear what I'm going to say. So let's say they just fall into the Orthodox tradition and they start negotiating with various old, true Orthodox synods. Okay, let's say the problem's solved. 50 years from now, this issue may be resolved by further research, and everyone may just agree that Paisius of Mount Athos is a saint. They may say he's not. We don't know. The point is, from our perspective, we have to work with what we have now. Because if you look at the Meletian schism, I mean, they were anathematizing each other. So, and some of them are saints of the church now. So, But
some of that anathematization was based upon what they believed the other people actually were saying, not actually.
Exactly.
So.
And that's it, but that's exactly my point. And so, if someone got duped by Patriarch Demetrius or something like that, and then they died, I mean, that's it's something that would have to be weighed out. I mean, if you start seeing miracles, everywhere, I mean, you can't fight.
Well, let's just leave it at that and go on.
Yeah, right. Okay, so. So have we touched enough on this topic, or should we move to the next?
I think so. My point is, I think the weakness of the book is it doesn't cover Canon 15, and it goes too much into, again, I think what is, strangely enough, Donatistic territory.
Yeah.
However, he is correct, Father Theodore, where he says the church is not just, the bishops. It's not just like a clerical preserve.
Yeah.
And people also make up the church, and they have a right to say something when things are going wrong. So, go ahead.
All right. Well, this moves us to the next thing that we're doing, and I guess it kind of ran in parallel, and it showed up on the war zone. I know that now you left the war zone, which is that's your prerogative. He's a bishop, guys. He's busy. The point is, so the point is that I was on the war zone recently. I saw that somebody had posted a video called "The Orthodox Guide to Navigating Jurisdictions" by none other than David the Real Med White, who we've talked about on the show before because his positions are kind of odd, but more importantly, he hates us. And so, I think that, in general, not us personally, but I think he just hates true orthodoxy. He likes calling it fake orthodoxy. So I'm going to move that to the screen because that's something that I wanted to talk about. Hold on a moment, and I will do that. But I'm actually going to put that on. Give me a moment, and I'm gonna skip to the part because he starts with an intro talking about. I guess he did some show where he was defending Father Peter Hears, or Father Peter Hears was on the show, and then it turned into which church to go to, and he got mad because I guess like true Orthodox people were like going off. But whatever the case may be, hold on. Let me see here if hold on. I did this wrong. Give me a moment. I got to do it again. And hold on.
Is it possible we can just go through the points without playing the video? That.
Oh yeah, I guess we could. Yeah, we could do that. Okay, so no,
simplest thing. All
right. Well, he does have a handy chart,
okay.
so we can just use the bullet points on it. So let's do that. And so if you look at this this handy chart here, I may as well just put that as a full screen, and then go back here. So he writes this thing, and he's reading off this list. So he says the temptations to join true orthodoxy, which of course he refers to as fake orthodoxy, which is funny because he's insulting Archbishop of Verki of blessed memory and many others who use the term true orthodoxy to mean exactly what we mean. Ironically, this video is about trying to avoid things like ecumenism, and that would be basically trying to follow true orthodoxy. So, but in any case, he starts off by saying, the grass is not greener on the other side. Catacomb Orthodoxy says David lives in Turkey and is under the EP. I'm pretty sure he lives in the U.S. He actually does not. He does not live in. He does not live in Turkey anymore. So, hold on one moment while I fix this because I'm going to change the title on this. And so then this. It starts out with, why was someone like Lazar Puhalo accepted by the old calendarists? Now, this is it's a fair question. And unfortunately, the answer is going to be much earthlier than we have to, we can just state it very simply. He was originally a deacon of Rocor, and if those who know, he was deposed over his views on the toll houses because he's one of those renovationist types who, we talk about a lot, who, condemn the toll houses and so on and so forth. And and so what ends up happening is he's got a pretty big property. And this is going to sound so tacky.
Well, first he joins the Free Serbs, by the way.
Right, he joined the Free Serbians, and he was with them for a while, and then he joined the Milan Synod. Now, this isn't a secret. In fact, I can just for a moment, if I may, give me just one moment here. Hold on. Just gonna go here. This, and I'm gonna switch this just for a sec. This is. Hold on. Share. And let's just go here. This is a book that I wrote, about our synod. I wrote this book 12 years ago. There's an entire chapter dedicated to Archbishop Lazar Puhalo, who was elevated by the Milan Synod after the Portuguese left and Metropolitan Ovogius was a new metropolitan. Basically, we detailed pretty heavily, including like the condemnations that were held of this guy. And so it's not like it's a secret. So we're not hiding that. The real secret, as I noted in my book, Lux Veritatis, is that if you go to the OCA's website, because after he left us for the what do you call them, the Ukrainian schismatics, Then he goes into the OCA as a retired bishop. His consecration date is literally the consecration date from the Milan Synod. So you can take away from that ultimately they recognize the Milan Synod's consecrations. We don't care. But the point is, the idea that it's like, the idea is to bring up Lazar Puhalo, who's a member of the OCA, in reference to us when he left us, doesn't really make sense. It's kind of goofy because you're talking about someone who's now, and by the way, when he was with us, he certainly wasn't preaching transgenderism or any other ridiculousness like that. I mean, so, I hate to say it, but David really has to ask himself, why would they accept him saying that? I mean, he says, well, they condemn what he writes. I haven't seen any condemnations. He still writes. I have no idea what he's talking about here. But, that was his argument that they condemn him. No, they don't condemn him. They accepted him. We condemn him.
Yes.
Technically,
we deposed him. So
yeah, exactly. We deposed him. So it's not our fault, not our problem.
It's more of an issue of somebody's with ROKOR, they join the Serbians, then they join the old calendarists for a few years, then they get tired of that, and then they join the OCA where they're there for the next 25 years.
Yeah, exactly. But the point is, everyone accepted him. I hate to say this because he had a nice monastery. From what I understand, he does have a nice monastery. And people often think in terms of worldly concerns. This happens in World Orthodoxy. It happens in True Orthodoxy. It is a fault of human nature.
And he's gotten crazier, and he just has gotten crazier over the years. So
yeah, exactly. And so then the next issue that David brought up here was logical issues with True Orthodox ecclesiology, specifically the communion line theory. I believe what he means by the communion line theory, I wanted to play the video because he's referring to if you're in communion with a heretic as opposed to being under a heretic. So if your bishop's not a heretic, but he's in communion with a heretic, he's condemned as well. Well, I think that, while that may be the most difficult part to argue, it's belied by history. Really, the only thing you have to I guess you could say, to disprove this argument is the fact that most of the time, bishops who are under heretics are usually heretics anyway. So they don't have to, like, for example, if you take what was the name of the archbishop before this last one of the Greek archdiocese? It was a previous archbishop who had the Jesus Seminar and gave them an award. John Dominic Crossan from the Jesus Seminar. If you don't know who the Jesus Seminar are, they're the people who wrote this atheistic kind of rewrite of what happened to Jesus and thought he was eaten by wild dogs or something. So this is somebody who was getting an award from the Greek Archdiocese. And so the point is, you don't even have to point to the ecumenical patriarch. The bishop here is doing that. I don't have to point to, I don't point to Archbishop Elpidoporus and say, well, he's in communion with Patriarch Bartholomew. Archbishop Elpidoporus is doing a fantastic job of showing off his heresy all by himself. He does not need help. And so thank you, Alexander. It's Demetrius. And then this is where we get into the whole thing where David and Jay Dyer have been saying this, and it's kind of dumb. Schismatics being used by intelligence agencies. Well, at least that's better than saying that they were on their payroll. But the point is, the simple reality is that the tricky part of this is that it's an equivocation, and I'll explain why. Because we have pointed out, and one of the things that True Orthodox have always pointed out with Russia is Sergianism. And how people are obedient, the bishops in hierarchy basically were rubber stamped by the KGB. So this is an attempt to say, well, your people were rubber stamped by the CIA, MI5, and so I think it's kind of hilarious because of the fact that, first off, these people fled communism, and if they were offering material support, in one case I know of a priest who was in ROKOR who did go to the army before becoming a priest, the U.S. Army after he fled Russia, and he worked as a translator. That's not the same thing as signing your life over to an atheistic state. It's just, especially if you want to see that atheistic state destroyed, it makes sense you would help people trying to do that. This is where he even brings up the Nazis, because that they didn't collaborate with the Nazis, but they were grateful to have a place to live, and they eventually did turn against the Nazis. But the point is that this is not the same thing, and ultimately, it's an unfounded assertion that the Greek old calendarists were basically CIA and blah blah blah.
It's very odd because the general accusation was that we were actually being used by Stalin. I don't know if you know that. In the post-45 period was that the old calendars were tools of Stalin.
Yeah.
And that was used as a justification for persecution of old calendars in the late 40s and 50s.
Yeah, no, that's true. They try to say that Metropolitan Chrysostom of Florida was a communist.
Yes, exactly. And even though, I mean, the Matthew Arts bring this every now and again, but no one's been able to locate this mysterious letter he wrote.
Yeah.
That doesn't exist. But that was that. So initially it goes from, oh, well, you know, you're tools of the Stalinists to, I guess what? Now you're tools of the CIA.
Yeah,
so
it's ridiculous. And finally, I thought this was hilarious. I got to be honest, it was kind of funny. It says, too easy to become clergy in there since no one is true Orthodox. That I had to admit that was funny, because you just get this impression that like people who come to true Orthodox become like insta priests or something. If that's true in a specific jurisdiction or under a specific bishop, don't know. I don't think so. I mean, in our jurisdiction, it takes a pretty good long while to get elevated. You know, I was part of our synod for 2 years before I was elevated.
The only exemptions you find about that in the church are generally if someone's coming from a group, like they have a parish, they have a mission or something like that. For example, like I think you can find examples in church history where if they would, like bishops would take in a whole diocese that would be, let's say, 30 or 40 parishes that were formerly Nestorian, all right? And they would say, well, as long as the priests agree to condemn Nestorianism and accept all the councils, the bishops might, you know, after a few weeks or something like that, make them priests. The former Nestorian priest would be made an Orthodox priest. But that's generally because they had communities to serve that were existing already. If you understand my meaning, probably.
Yeah, no, I do. And my point is that no, I don't think that that's necessarily true. And I think you might have found that was much more true, say, in the 80s and early 90s. Again, when you're dealing with the chaotic period of the...
Now, I notice 3 of these points aren't really dogmatic issues at all.
Yeah.
It's about, oh, well, they took in some bad people, and supposedly they have some kind of cooperation with some intelligence agency, and some priest did this, and another.
Where's my check? That's what I'm wondering.
A third is, you know, some of their bishops make priests too fast. Yeah. Well, those are issues that don't really have that strong of a dogmatic basis, and really only the second one, the ecclesiological issue, is, I guess, kind of a dogmatic objection of some sort. Yeah. So.
No, I think that you know, it's now there are cases of necessity, and that it makes sense where, you know, there isn't a priest for a flock, etc., and you know they're far away. You know, these are practical things, but it's not like we're not alone in that.
Well, that's an interesting objection, because one of the things I've heard people ask me or accuse us of is saying that, look, if I join you, I have no priest to go to. You're asking me to drive 6, 7, 8 hours. And you know, people have said, well, can't you just make a priest closer? I'm like, well, who am I supposed to make? Yeah, exactly. Oftentimes it's the case in which you can't find people who want to be made priests, because they don't want the responsibility of it.
People want the parish, but they don't want to do the work.
Exactly. I mean, there are cases in which you have missions or church buildings in which you'll have a community there, you know, 20, 30, 40, maybe more people, and nobody wants to be made a reader even. But they want priests to go there. I mean, it's you know, that's, I mean, for example, we're dealing with, at least for my case, issues in the Philippines where we don't have enough priests.
Yeah.
We're down to like 7 active priests, and you know, we're having to deal with 15 or 20 missions, and
we're gonna have to make more. That's it.
Well, we're trying to find people to say, well, you know, there are some people who can in the future, but it's a case where people oftentimes don't. You know, you can have cases of men who don't want to be made priests, not for any legitimate reason other than the fact that, I mean, I guess you can call it a legitimate reason, that it's a responsibility that, you know, they realize the responsibility of it. And so nobody wants to take responsibility for what actually has to happen.
Yeah.
People would rather be, in many cases, for lack of a better word, lay theologians, quote unquote, and, you know, and act as readers, but not be readers. Because then you can kind of, I mean, as a lay person, to be honest, you have a lot more freedom in what you can do and say about a number of issues.
A lot less accountability.
Exactly. Whereas, the higher you get up in clerical rank, people get more upset about, just innocent things that were, own comments, opinions. So, I wish we had enough priests. We don't.
Yeah, and but this is a problem, and it's, by the way, this is a problem everywhere. So the idea that there's everyone's got a priest in World Orthodoxy is also misleading.
Now, interestingly, in Russia, before the Petrine reforms, and before the spiritual regulation, whatever you want to make of that, and it was very problematic to begin with in 1719. But one of the issues they had in Russia was you would have cases back in like 1700 where there would be one priest at one priest attached to a village church that would have 400, 500 people. But then 7 miles down the road, there would be some shrine church erected by a boyar 50 years ago, in which would have something like 12 priests attached to, and their only duty was to, use one of the, celebrate liturgy on 4 or 5 different holy places and do panahidas all day. And that was all they ever did. All right, priests just ordained for the purpose of celebrating liturgy and doing panahidas. All right, so I mean, it's not like it's a new issue where bishops would just go around. I mean, in many ways, in the 1600s, whether you consider that bad or good, it was actually a much more of a more dangerous issue, where they have the concept that a priest's main function, obviously, and it is true, is to offer sacrifice. And so it got to the point, let's say, where they would just make 15, 20, 30 priests, and they'd be attached to a large church in the middle of nowhere, and their only purpose was to go into the many sanctuaries, the holy places that were built around it, and to celebrate liturgy for the dead every day. All right? So, they didn't know how to preach, they didn't know how to necessarily hear confessions or do anything else. But then again, that's Russia in the 1600s. You had a multitude of people you could rely on. Now we're in a situation where you convert lay people, and you don't have enough people who want to become clergy.
Yeah.
And then when you have people who want to become clergy, you have to be careful because, this is true everywhere. Maybe there are going to be people who hope they're going to find some kind of accolade. I can tell you, in any, even the mainline groups, but especially in so-called old calendars groups, there's not going to be many accolades accorded or afforded to you. You're not going to get any kind of pension. Maybe some of the other clergy and lay people might help you out with your, rent or whatever every now and again, or light bill if there's a problem.
Yeah.
You're going to have to be working. You're going to be in a position where you're going to have to build from, if you have maybe 4 or 5 people who wanted a priest to be made, and they may simply eventually agree that, they don't like this priest for this or that reason. And, so, I mean, I really wish we had dozens of people coming to us and wanted to sincerely be made priests and work to establish missions. I really wish that was the issue.
Yeah.
But that's simply not the case. Most of the people who come who beg to be ordained, assuming they don't have if they have a community and they're willing to, and they accept orthodoxy, that's a different issue because they're having the responsibility for other souls. But other cases, it's just, what happens in church history is what happens now. If somebody ordains such a person a priest, they might stay around for a few years, and then eventually they have to be released or whatever. But that's not specifically endemic to quote unquote old calendarists.
Yeah, the point is there's just a lack of priests everywhere.
And even the establishment of the seminary system hasn't necessarily alleviated any of these problems. The seminary system was supposed to be established to alleviate the problem of clerical incompetence.
Yep.
That is, you could train bishops, you could train priests. It's not super difficult necessarily to train people to do the correct rituals because a lot of that's memorization, if you know what I mean. All right. Yep. But to train them to give correct answers, to understand how to give correct answers, not necessarily give rote answers. All right. Because if you memorize the catechism of the catechism of 1650 or whatever, and you just memorize it, but you don't really read and understand it, you're not really going to be able to stand up against people who come up with heresies or other evil teachings. And that's again what happens. Look what happened to Antioch in 1720. Yeah. Talk about case in history. The entire Antiochian Patriarchate apostatized from Orthodoxy in 1724. except for a few people, and they had to make monks Sylvester or Christopher, who was a Greek archimandrite,
they had to
basically
run them over to make
exactly. They had to rebuild everything almost from scratch. So the concept of bad people getting ordained, or was Orthodoxy really that great if an entire patriarchate left? Well, Orthodoxy is that great. Oftentimes, the people who were the clergy and laity, we may not be that great, and there may be significant issues. But that's not itself a dogmatic issue. That goes back to the issue we discussed with, let's say, with people like Father Theodore Zisis and others. This Father Sava I mentioned. That is, they practically may admit in private that they agree with you about these issues, and they may say, well, look, I won't attack you, I don't choose to do that, but I understand why you did that. But their explanations to why they don't join are oftentimes based upon more earthly concerns, for lack of a better word, or practical concerns. I hate to use that.
I hate to say this, but I have met priests that were in World Orthodoxy, and they have a family to support. I mean, for lack of a better word, that's probably the best argument for them. I don't know if that's a good argument for lay people, but it is definitely a good argument for a priest. You're going to go from having, basically a pension, a paycheck, health care, to nothing. Nobody wants that. So I don't know. I think it's kind of insulting, this claim. It's funny, but it's insulting because nobody comes in to there's very few exceptions I can think in true Orthodoxy. I think one exception might be Father Stephen Allen in Chicago. What's it called? He has a significant community and he can afford the support. But a lot of times, outside of the big churches, you're on your own. So there's none of this. You build from ground zero, and so it's very, very frustrating to hear a claim like this being made on a YouTube video, and then a bunch of people believe it because it's false. It's depressing.
And if you become true Orthodox and you're eventually made a reader or maybe even a higher clergy, your life is going to be full of just simply slanders and attacks on you by World Orthodox people. That's all it's going to be.
Yeah.
And maybe some nice people you meet, but their concept is they will slander and attack you and say negative things about you and even make nasty phone calls to you with the hope that you eventually join them. Although if somebody like that eventually joins you because enough pressure is put on them, have you really made a trustworthy convert to begin with? And some people, so I mean that's kind of the attitude I've seen with some of these individuals. It seems is that of kind of a high school clique attitude of trying to exclude somebody and to kind of run them down and talk about them behind their back. It's all very sophomoric and teenagerish.
I was going to say very mean girls.
Yes, I suppose so.
But in any case, the point is...
But to be honest, that happens with, either even true Orthodox who would do that. So, I mean, that's an issue that's simply how people operate in society today.
Yeah, that just means people are bad. That's not really a good argument for any Orthodox church whatsoever.
I mean, if you go to an Orthodox church and the people are mean there, or they just ignore you, does that mean Orthodoxy is false? No. It just means those people are behaving badly. Yeah.
So. And maybe it's your job to fix them. Who knows what the purpose is to...
Or it's your job just to get baptized and chrismated and, save yourself if you can't help other people.
Or become the priest and take over, and then you can anathema. No, I'm just kidding.
No.
Anyway, all right. No thoughts of revenge. But in any case...
But again, that's a point. But the point about clergy is oftentimes, for example, there are cases, at least I've been involved in dealing with, in which you have a priest and he wants to have a successor, and it takes 7-8 years to convince somebody in the parish to become a reader, and then to want to move beyond that.
Yeah.
And because they have to realize, look, if they're going to take over from Father so and so, then they saw Father so and so basically have maybe 30-40 people he built up, or maybe 20 people, in which those people give maybe they give money to keep the lights on it, and maybe sometimes, but you're going to be struggling. You're going to be working a full-time job. At the same time, you're going to be expected by everybody to take care of all their needs spiritually.
Yeah.
So oftentimes people simply, after enough years of that, a lot of people may simply give up. They get burnt out by that. They don't want to deal with it anymore. And
Yeah.
that's always a tragedy. And they not necessarily they're going to leave the church. They're just going to say, look, I can't do this. I'm 65. I've convinced a few people to become readers. None of them want to be made deacons. And I don't know what to do. So
Yeah, and it is a problem. It's a real problem. We do lack enough clergy. So, I think that that's something to. Now, Alexander Brown does ask an interesting question about the video. He says, out of curiosity, what does the video say to go from his point of view? I'll be honest with you. A lot of it starts sounding like a real estate agent. Like he's like, find a good church, even if it's in a bad jurisdiction. And I think that's really terrible neophyte advice. I would never really suggest that. But in any case, it becomes more along the lines of like he mentions this Archimandrite Gerasim of the OCA basically saying that people shouldn't be going from parish to parish looking for the mysteries because they might become inspired to, rebel or stuff like that. And this was during the whole coronavirus crisis when, virtually all of the churches of the World Orthodox closed down. There were some exceptions. Some people with conscience didn't, and good on them. The point is that, that's a perfectly good reason if your priest decides, hey, I'm going to shut down the church over a flu. That's a good reason to go. And anyone who says otherwise is just trying to keep everyone in order, keep everything in line. That's not the way things are supposed to go. We're supposed to be at least marginally heroic in our faith. And I mean, if showing up is heroic, I mean, what standards do we have left? That's I think that's part of the thing that's as I said, this virus thing has kind of shot everyone. Yeah, and now Suffering Orthodoxy makes a good point. He says, I'm friendly with world jurisdiction friends. My friends from the OCA are attending our baptism. They call me schismatic, and we laugh about it. I know my position. They know theirs. It's not like you become TO and then you have to cut world Orthodox out of your life. Be firm in your apologetics, but remain loving to others. That's exactly true. I mean, I don't want to sound like, like I have a world Orthodox friend. I'm pretty sure I have a few. In any case, and some of them are clergy now, and I've talked to them. I don't talk to many people ever since I got married with the whole family thing. I don't really have friends, but I have lots of acquaintances. Is my point. And so that's but that's true of everyone. Orthodoxy is a small world, and we all kind of know each other. So,
I mean, if you think about it, Greece has 10 million Greeks living in it. That's the country. It's basically the size of Alabama.
Yeah, and
it's a third of the population of Florida.
Yeah, and it's the physical size of Florida. So
No. Florida's bigger. It's actually the size of Alabama. I have looked this up.
Oh, okay. I could have sworn it was Florida, but okay.
Florida is.
I haven't done the square footage comparison in a long time. So you're probably right on this, Woody.
But the point is that many of the people, I think we have to, I know, even though they may be making videos attacking this person or us or whatever, with many of these people who are new to, even world Orthodoxy, I think you have to be, at least, we have to be a little, tolerant. I know we don't want to go too far with that, but because a lot of the things they're working through, I myself worked through 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I might have had the exact same opinions as David. In fact, I know I did 20 years ago when all I knew was like the OCA and the Greek Archdiocese and this and this and this. And all you heard was, basically caricature arguments, and you didn't really know that much about all the issues. But as, people change over 20 years.
Yeah.
Especially. So, see what happens.
Yeah, some of these things can only be solved with time. And so, Timothy said not only that, but the change in communion has been very scandalous, practically spilling it due to heretical beliefs. I witnessed it as a server. I'm not sure what they're doing. That sounds terrifying, and I'd hate to see that. And then Atomic Lead wrote, I don't know any setters who express this much charity towards Novus Ordoites and Conciliar Catholics. Well, I think the reason for that, Atomic, is because of the fact that our structure is completely different. We Orthodox have our true Orthodoxy is a living example of Orthodoxy's fail-safe mechanism at work. And what I mean by that is This has happened before. We have had heretical crises happen before in the church, and the church always just reforms itself and works itself out over what can be a period of decades or even a century. But the point is, the Sedevacantists, unfortunately, and I got sent some notes from the guy who wrote the Sedevacantist Delusion. I'd love to ask him if he could be on the show. He actually sent me an email. But the point is that the Sedevacantist position, by its nature, is self-contradictory. You cannot be a papist without a pope. And so eventually that leads to psychological desperation, which is why people follow, lunatics like the Diamond Brothers.
Now, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think Atomic Lead is he's on to a point here that all the true Orthodox people I've met people who aren't part of my jurisdiction. I've never got the same impression. Now, maybe I haven't met too many Sedevacantists in person, so maybe I'm, but it does seem the attitude, there's something about their psychology and their attitude that's very much different. Even though they, sociologically, you can say, well, they're a conservative group that doesn't want to be part of the mainstream liberal group. I mean, that's kind of this comparison that's being made.
Parallel that you can really
but when you go down into how, I guess, psychological differences, the mentality, they're very, very different than most true Orthodox and as opposed to Sedevacantists. I mean, I can think of maybe a few Sedevacantists who maybe really set up Provationists or something like that are amicable people whenever you've for example, not defending him, but they were Sedevacantists where they were like there was his father Anthony Cicada. I don't know if he's still alive. A few of them could make interesting.
Bishop now.
Yeah, well, my point is that you could watch their videos and things they wrote, and you could tell they were psychologically normal people, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
They held Sedevacantist views, but they're kind of normal people. They're not going to chew your head off. They might tell you you're going to hell, but to be honest, a lot of people say that, so that's not too big of a deal. So, but I think in the case of true Orthodoxy, I just haven't run into that many. And now there are those crazies out there, but I just haven't personally met that many of them myself.
I mean, I've met, it's a different kind, and that's what I mean by psychological. It's a different kind of thing, because if your belief system requires the Pope and you don't have the Pope, then you're automatically in, for lack of a better word, you're automatically in apocalypse mode. The worst has to come. In theory, we're always, the Antichrist is always around the corner, but it's not something that we're like sitting here like, well, we're not spiritual preppers. No, that's actually wrong, because I'd say we are kind of spiritual preppers, but preppers are usually they know what they have. I don't know how to explain it. It's kind of like maybe spiritual rioters, like they're like terrified and they don't know what to do, so they're acting like crazy people. It's a different system, because for us, it's just like, okay, the church goes on. When I first met Bishop Enoch, I first met him as a layperson, and my bishop is, my metropolitan. And the point is, fast forward 15 years, and, now I'm co-hosting with a bishop. The point is, we know that this is actually just, we're going to be okay. There is a future. And I think a Sedevacantist doesn't know when that future is going to happen. He's waiting for the miracle Pope to show up, and because he doesn't, it freaks him out. Gregory of Colorado, is he really a sede? I think he's a cult leader, and not a very good one. He's only got like 3 parishes, and that's what he's had for like the past, 3 decades. But the point is that that's different. There is crazy there. There's no doubt. But it's not the same kind of crazy, because that would be the equivalent of much closer to conclavists, like David Bodden, like the dude who thinks he's the Pope in Idaho. Like that's more Gregory of Colorado. It's like, he's holding all salvations through him.
Just to close out about the psychological or the approach difference, I don't know if you recall several years ago, Father, maybe I was still a deacon, but I think we wrote an open letter to traditionalist Roman Catholics. And maybe I was a priest at the time. I don't remember. Several years ago.
Yeah, we did. But yeah, you were a priest. Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, I'm thinking I'm thinking actually I was a deacon, because I think I was Father Augustine at the time. How are you going to Augustine? Okay. But anyway, and we thought, well, let's just send it out to a lot of these traditionalist Roman Catholic website email addresses.
It was really it was kind of almost naivety, because we were like, well, they don't have a pope, we don't have a pope, they're Western Rite, we're Western Rite, they should love us. That's not what happened.
It was more than that. We were trying to explain that they were simply sedevacantist 1,000 years late.
Yeah.
We didn't simply just say, oh, these are the only difference. We went into detail to explain to them the problems with sedevacantism, and that the only logical conclusion would be orthodoxy.
Which we thought would make sense.
Which is, yes. And we didn't really get a lot of responses, but I think there were a few that did respond, and many of them were just simply quite angry and bewildered. And one person, I believe, a few of them gave a few email exchanges happened, and one of them said, "Look, if you contact me anymore, I'm just simply going to renounce God." And I was like, "What?" I could not believe it. I wasn't trying to do that. I was trying to say, look, here are the, they were trying to say that they were making actually Sabellian arguments at one point for the Trinity to prove the Filioque. And I said, look, what you put is contradictory to St. John Damascene, and you have to accept him as a father. And they said, just don't contact me anymore. I don't know what to believe anymore. And I didn't contact him anymore. I didn't, because I didn't know what to do. But it seems that some of them are in this kind of constant psychological state of crisis, if you know what I mean. And that's something that some of us are familiar with. Where any creak, any argument made against you, anything said against you, lead your complete collapse. You got to go run to find someone to make a counter argument. You're constantly looking back and forth for people to make counter arguments to a counter argument to a counter argument. And it's like the apostle said, they're blown to and fro with every wind of doctrine. I think one person out of that we did have somebody who was an SSPX person, by the way, that did leave the SSPX and was baptized by one of the priests, and there's people support of us. So we did have one positive result from that.
Well, that's good. I didn't even know about that one.
Yeah. But it was years ago, and they're still with us, and that's good. My point again is with a lot of them, it seemed to be again like they were predicting a Marian. This is something I learned from these exchanges. There was supposed to be a Marian millennium. There was supposed to be the role of the Holy Pope for 1,000 years. They had new visionaries coming up every now and again. The true Pope would come from like Scandinavia or something like that. There would be the French king that would return. And it was just
because they've collected all these beliefs and doctrines.
But oftentimes they were very well. To some extent, you could say that some of this was mediated through quote unquote pseudo Methodius. I don't know if it's really pseudo, but prophecies attributed to Saint Methodius who lived in the early 300s, not Methodius of Cyril Methodius fame, but earlier Saint Methodius. And the Crusaders did supposedly bring some of these back, although I think actually there were Anglo-Saxon and variations of them before that. But they were simply originally meant to say that there would be like the Roman emperor would be overthrown, and then the Roman emperor would come back, who would be Orthodox, and that's kind of, you do see some of that with many of the beliefs about the return of the true Tsar. Yeah. All right. But generally, I don't think we're saying the true Tsar is going to reign for 1,000 years. And we're not trying to recapitulate a millennium, because the church teaching, as far as I understand, is that the millennium is really a symbolic number for the reign of the church now. That we're not going to see 1,000 years after the time of Antichrist of peace. But it was eye-opening to see again the attitude that many of these individuals had, where they were in this constant state of crisis about everything falling apart, with emotional problems, and it was very disconcerting. That all I could do was pray for them because they didn't want to interact anymore.
Yeah.
Are there people like that who do join to Orthodoxy? Yeah, I believe so, but they eventually kind of burn out, and they then either what happens, they then go back to World Orthodoxy, or they go to some other group. But that's more, I think, a psychological issue where you can advise them to look. I would say to them, look, here's some spiritual writings, here's some works of the Church Fathers, and often these are cases of inquirers, and they never get further than a few emails with me, and they want me to provide some sort of knockdown answer to every single objection they give, And when I explain to them, look, some of these questions can be answered simply, but they have still complex answers within a simplicity. They don't want to accept that. And so then they move on to another group, and then on to so there is truth to that jurisdiction hopping, but that's actually something endemic, I believe, of the modern mentality. Where it's all about what someone said, a nasty photo with captions someone posted, the meme stuff, trying to be, again, the mean girl type thing, and someone said this about you, and first someone contacted me, not me, but some contact that was get forwarded to me, in which someone said these bad things against Bishop so and so. And I was like, well, are they? Why is that my concern? Another point was some of it wasn't even true. Most of it wasn't even true. All of it wasn't even true. And whatever was true was simply exaggeration. But again, you can go back to the 4th century if you want to go. I constantly go back to the 4th century because I love the tripartite history, which is oftentimes called, which is the history of Socrates, of Constantinople, Sozomenus, Scholasticus, and St. Theodore. They all actually may be saints. And those are the 3 main historians of the 400s, of the 4th century, 300s, and early 4th century that are so important. When you want to understand how the church operates, when one, we had an emperor who then becomes apostate, the Arian, that is, the Arians take over the imperial throne. So we can't rely upon the imperial center as unity anymore. And 2, when all the different bishops who were Orthodox began to attack each other. And what you find is everything falls apart. The church doesn't fall apart, but synodal administrative structure completely disintegrates. And things only repair themselves when you have Emperor St. Theodosius come about and orders everybody to come to Constantinople. There's so much respect for him as a person that they do that. And even then, remember, Rome didn't even send anybody to Constantinople I. Alexandria, I don't think, even sent anybody to Constantinople I. And even after the Second Ecumenical Council exonerated St. Meletius and tried to exonerate, St. Cyril of Constantinople by basically approving of a declaration of the canonicity of his episcopate back in, which was made a year earlier, back in 379, I believe, or something, before the council. You still have people in Palestine who simply did not recognize, for example, St. Jerome. I don't think St. Jerome ever recognized, he and his monks and the other monastic communities associated with him, I don't think they ever recognized the Bishop of Jerusalem until St. Cyril died, and then eventually Bishop John of Jerusalem became bishop. And even then they had fights with him. And the same thing happened in Antioch. Antioch's situation between the Paulicians, the Eustathians, the Old Orthodox, and the Meletians, that wasn't even resolved until after Rome and Alexandria finally agreed not to recognize somebody in 497, and then it kind of fell away in 415 when everybody reunited. So even in those best case scenarios, you have an Orthodox emperor, you have all these Orthodox saintly figures and Orthodox patriarchates. It's a situation where it gradually gets better because of pressure from the emperor, pressure from other people in the hierarchy, and then older generations simply die out who held all these animosities.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons.
Now, my only point I bring up is we don't have any of that today.
Yeah.
So, if there is no Orthodox imperium, then things will gradually degenerate, and that's what's happened since the overthrow of the Tsar. The papacy, the Hildebrandians tried to turn the papacy into kind of the pseudo-imperium, but that just caused even more problems. And that ultimately wasn't successful there. So, okay.
Well, all I was going to point out to that was simply that there's a reason why you find in many prayer books that one of the prayers is heal the schisms of the churches. And this is because, quite frankly, the churches have always had problems. It's the nature of orthodoxy in general, unfortunately. And so, the idea that orthodoxy existed as some sort of monolithic structure isn't real. It's just not how things went. And
one only need read the first session of the Seventh Ecumenical Council to discover that how many people think of kind of this top-down ecclesiology which I believe there has been too much emphasis on that. I mean, you have to have bishops to be the church. Let's be frank about that.
Obviously.
Yes, so that if you claim there are no bishops left, then something's wrong with your ecclesiology. I mean, if you're claiming, well, there are true bishops somewhere, but we don't know where they are, that's a little bit different than saying there are no bishops left.
Yeah.
So, because if you read the first session of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, which you can find for free online, James Crystal's translation, just don't read his notes, because the notes are pretty terrible. But if you read the translation, it's all right. I mean, either that or by what's his name, the guy
Price's,
who did
like
Price's $300 translation, which is kind of crazy. But the whole debate of the first session was whether they should even accept Patriarch Saint Tiresias as even Orthodox, as even validly consecrated. Because remember, he wasn't consecrated while Constantinople was in union with the church, and that was a big issue. Because the monks, because remember, there were large monastic communities that had never succumbed to iconoclasm.
Yeah.
They consistently resisted it. And they said, exactly, the Studites and people like that, So what happens is that when Rome sends legates, there was Archpriest Peter. I mean, he was just archpresbyter. I don't think that he sent a bishop. I think maybe the other patriarch had sent one or two bishops or a presbyter or something like that. They regarded Constantinople too. Constantinople, Nicaea too. Sorry, they regarded Nicaea too, the Seventh Council, as essentially trying to get Constantinople back into the church. So the monks at the council say, "Look, we can't accept Tiresias or the people ordained by him because they were ordained by heretics, who were ordained by heretics, who were ordained by heretics." And in fact, if you read in I got it right here. It's the Chronicle, I believe, of Theophanes. Yes. So the Chronicle of Saint Theophanes. Saint Theophanes was one of the opponents of iconoclasm. He talks about how during the time of Patriarch Saint Paul IV, who was originally an iconoclast, and he dies around 785, I believe. Saint Paul IV comes to the conclusion that iconoclasm is a heresy. He's Patriarch of Constantinople, so he says, "Look, I have to resign. I can't serve. I don't think I'm a bishop." And so the Empress and the Senate come out to him and say, "What should we do?" And they say, "Look, we've been in schism and heresy from the Catholic Church," he says, "for 50 years. Yeah, if you want to save your souls, you have to go back and you have to repent of this heresy and go back into union with the church." So at that point, Patriarch Paul retires to a monastery, which is presumably when he rejoins the church, and he just dies as a monk. All right. But before that, they had consecrated Saint Tiresias. Mm-hmm. That is, people who were formerly consecrated by iconoclast schismatics, heretics, consecrated him. So that's the whole argument at the Seventh Council. And eventually, they come up with all. Now, by the way, I'm not saying the minutes of that council are dogmatic declarations. My understanding is that the minutes of ecumenical councils are not treated as dogmatically infallible declarations, which is they're not the canons and they're not the dogmatic decrees. Okay, and we know from the whole discussion about Chalcedon and the Fifth Council that simply discussions embedded in the minutes are not afforded automatic, dogmatic status. All right.
Right.
Because if you read some of the discussions in the first session, I have to admit, and this is no insult to Patriarch Saint Tiresias, some of it's pretty strange, the arguments they're doing to justify why they shouldn't be reordained. Now, it could be, I need to read more, and I'm willing to do that, but they bring up the case of St. Meletius. Now, that's why I bring up the 4th century so much, with St. Meletius, Paulinus, all these other ones, because this issue was brought up in other times in history. In which Patriarch Tiresias says, well, this is what he says. He says that you can take ordinations from schismatic heretical bishops if you are Orthodox and you intend to be Orthodox even after the ordination. So, and now the monks did not like the argument. You can tell why. And so Patriarch Tiresias says, well, St. Meletius was ordained by Arian heretics. And, the monks were willing to concede they wouldn't rebaptize Patriarch Tiresias, but they didn't want to accept the ordination. Now, this discussion goes on, and eventually I think what happens, without necessarily vindicating either side's arguments, they agree that they will accept him almost like in his orders, for lack of a better word, if you know what I mean. They don't say that, but that's kind of the conclusion to it. And part of the argument may have been, look, if they have to reordain 300 bishops and then thousands of priests and then rechristmate people.
It would be insane.
What was going to happen was that, one, the iconoclasts were going to come back to power. People would just become psychologically so affected to the fact they're going to have to go get reordained again. They're going to be told everything they did was fake. Even if they were, because you had groups of people who were priests that were ordained by iconoclast heretics, who then, went off to, be Orthodox, or in their minds were Orthodox. Now, that doesn't mean that we say the iconoclast heretics, schismatics had grace, but they did grant this condescension to them.
They used economy.
Yes, and the other part, of course, was that a lot of things at the council weren't granted. For example, there were cases in which Rome and Antioch wanted territory back. Now, I think Patriarch St. Tarisius was willing to give them Greece back in southern Italy, but the empress didn't want to do it. So they didn't do that, which also caused instability later on, because Rome technically acknowledged the dogmatic decree, but they didn't call it the Seventh Ecumenical Council for a very long time. And even Antioch didn't do that, which in fact, I believe, they would acknowledge the council was dogmatically accurate, but this caused destabilization, I think, for Patriarch Tarisius, and the iconoclasts were always in the wings. But my point was, you can look at those discussions, and you can see how, well, look, the Orthodox side wins, obviously. Everybody acknowledges Orthodoxy is true. But there are all these other weird questions where people are making strange arguments that don't quite conform to how some of the more crazy or linear ways of thinking intra-Orthodox in the 20th century have been, and nor in world Orthodoxy. Now, that doesn't mean Orthodoxy is not true. It just means there has been a lack of historical knowledge in the 20th century, in the 21st century.
And that's ultimately, and I think this is one of the things that is changing, is because first off, the nature of ecumenism itself makes people stupid. And I'm just putting that very simply, because the idea is, if nobody studies the truth and nobody wants to learn how things work in truth, people are just going to, they become dumber. And this is true on all sides, unfortunately, because if you're lacking in apologetics, if you're lacking in an ability to defend the faith, and you just simply say, well, the faith is there, accept it, then guess what? Nobody's going to have a nuanced understanding of why. And so that's part of the reason why I think that the 20th century, I hate to say it, granted, one can make the argument, and I have before, that, obviously if you're fleeing persecution, you don't have time to write great letters about, the
Absolutely.
exact, but we do now. So what's the excuse now? Now we have to do that.
Yeah, for example, and I think we have this conversation on another forum, where I was pointing out that, look, when the Orthodox delegates, there were really only 38. I think there were actually only 20 Orthodox bishops that actually went to Florence. People sometimes say hundreds of Greek bishops were there. That's not true.
Yeah, the Greek delegation was
small. Exactly. But when they went, they had absolutely minimal to somewhat above moderate knowledge of any Latin fathers. St. Mark of Ephesus, I think, basically had read St. Augustine in some translations and knew maybe some letters of St. Gregory the Great. But even St. Mark of Ephesus, who was probably the most educated of those there, he couldn't really use the Latin fathers to make a defense. And he simply said, I don't believe what you're saying about them, or I just can't address it.
Yep.
And what happened as a result, now, St. Mark was still right in what he did, because St. Mark's argument was, look, if I can prove the Greek fathers believe this, and I can show the ecumenical councils taught this, and we have to all accept the ecumenical councils, then that's alone sufficient. And he's correct. He was absolutely correct on that. And that should have won the day by itself. And by the way, if you read Ostromov's book, he talks about how when St. Mark of Ephesus gave his famous exposition, which I don't know if it's ever been translated or even exists other than Seropolis talking about it, at the council, there were even Dominicans who were so shocked after hearing St. Mark's exposition of the canons and the ecumenical councils and what makes councils and the consensus of the fathers, they turned around and they said that the Greeks teach the truth. And that caused consternation among the Roman Catholics on their side, because if the Dominicans who run the Inquisition are saying, well, this Mark of Ephesus guy is making a lot of sense, even with the handicap of not knowing the Latin fathers, that was, they were moving somewhere.
Yeah.
But in the end, what happens is St. Mark becomes a lone voice. The other Greek delegates simply just, even mention Anthony of Heraclea, who kind of signed the declaration on his deathbed. So was he really even cognizant of what he was doing? He was said to be not too educated of a man, and he just, repudiated the union almost immediately after signing it. So you're dealing with a few people who don't know the Latin Fathers, and the result is the papists could simply just make up whatever they want. They could give interpolated texts.
Yeah, and then they had
could interpret.
as I understand it, the problem is that they had the smartest bishops there were Saint Mark, Isidore of Kiev, and Bessarion. But the problem is that
only one out of three of those remained Orthodox.
Well, and that's because the other two were bribed, and that's very clear. And they basically take the Latin side halfway through, leaving Saint Mark alone because they knew they couldn't bribe him. And so,
in the Georgian delegation, to their credit, as soon as they arrive, they stay for like 2 weeks, and they're like, "Well, no, we're not staying here," because they realize what the emperor and the Greek delegates were going to do. So, the Georgians leave. The Serbians don't even go. But my point is that the papists were able to run wild with the Latin Fathers, and they gave the impression to many of the Greek delegates that the Latin Fathers had always believed in ultramontanism, had always believed apparently even unleavened bread and used it, had always taught the filioque, had always taught purgatorial fire, and this, and this, and this, and this. So the result is what? Even though these delegates may go back and repudiate the union, their impressions are going to be, well, I guess there always was some sort of problem or errors there. And this isn't really sufficiently cleared up until you get to maybe there was, I think Patriarch Meletius Pigas actually wrote a book defending St. Augustine. I mean, they accepted him as a saint, but basically repudiating the Latin papist interpretation of him. And then it's really only until you get to Zernikoff in the 1680s, who had the blessing to have been knowledgeable and very, very knowledgeable and fluent in Greek and Latin and even Slavonic, and had studied the fathers and manuscripts and publication histories.
He also had access to the financial means to actually find these.
He was a nobleman. Exactly. Yeah. He was a Polish-German nobleman, Count Vernzarnikov. And so I think at one point he was at Cambridge and Oxford. He went back from a Lutheran to a Roman Catholic. And then eventually he decided that I've got to study this issue. And he was able to produce his great 1,000-page tome book and vindicate the Latin Fathers on this issue. Whereas you have cases even in the early 1700s, I think of one patriarch, Adrian of Moscow, wondering if they should even include St. Jerome in the calendar because St. Dmitri Rostov had said, no, he's a saint. And Patriarch Adrian's like, I don't know anything about him, so should I even include him? And St. Dimitri's like, no, he is a saint. He died hundreds of years before this isn't to begin with. And secondly, even if he's not been on the Byzantine calendar, that doesn't mean he's not a saint. I mean, oftentimes people like St. Patrick, oftentimes when they bring up the case that, oh, well, St. Augustine was only added to the Greek calendar and by St. Nicodemus, well, that doesn't necessarily prove anything because I don't think St. Ambrose when was St. Ambrose put on the Byzantine calendar? Some sources say maybe in the 1600s.
Yeah.
That didn't mean they didn't have a service somewhere written to him or they didn't call him St. Ambrose in various texts. All right. So that's kind of been part of the problem that Orthodox, we do know what's true, what's right, because we have the consensus tradition of the fathers passed down to us. And we have the councils. But when it comes to issues about do we have all the correct texts, are we making necessarily, great arguments? I mean, you can have the right conclusion and have a generally good argument, but you can have giant holes in your argument and still get to the right place, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And that has to be corrected. It doesn't mean you're rejecting tradition, or it doesn't mean if someone were to come up to, for example, there was the whole Martin the Armenian forgery. People don't know about it. It doesn't really play much of a role in Orthodox discourse, but it was a forgery that was concocted by somebody in 1700 to prove that the two-finger sign of the cross was invented by the Armenians. It was a forgery. It's now acknowledged. Even the later period in the Russian Church, they acknowledge it's a forgery. But you had Orthodox saints using this to say, you see, all believers, the two-finger sign of the cross was invented by the Armenian heretics. And this, you're taking things from Armenian heretics. Well, the problem is once the old believers had some scholars that began to poke holes in this, what did it do? It made the church look bad. And it made it look like we were relying on bad text. And so even if you can quote, let's say, St. Paisius Velachowski quoting this text, it doesn't mean he's lying, but it does mean people are using sometimes bad scholarship. Now, despite bad scholarship, can you still arrive at orthodoxy? Absolutely. No question about it. If you just gave me the ecumenical councils, that's all I was able to read, and I was to choose between Roman Catholicism and orthodoxy, I'd still choose not Roman Catholicism, but Roman orthodoxy. All right, I'd orthodoxy. But that doesn't mean there aren't major gaps Orthodox have to fill in and to correct over time. It doesn't mean the rejection of tradition, obviously, but it means taking a perspective that looks at the fathers as a whole. I could even say if you gave me just the Latin fathers, I would still come to orthodoxy. If that's all I could read was the Latin fathers, I would still come to orthodox conclusions. So.
Yeah, because the Latin fathers have been largely ignored in the Roman Church. Nathan asks, also, what do you think of the claim that saints who walled themselves off in the past from heretics and were always in communion with someone who was in communion with the rest of the church? I'm not sure how well that holds with the life of St. Maximus the Confessor. Or, there have been cases where people were basically walled off completely in communion with, no one because of their situation, and that would resolve itself eventually. I don't know that that's exactly what's happening now, because
let's look at that question interestingly. Back in the 1970s, so say 1973, was Roquefort technically in communion with Jerusalem and Serbia? I think they were. They didn't make a big issue of it, and they didn't consult with the patriarch. But I think people. Am I correct in saying that there was some technical communion between the two? Right.
Yeah.
Roquefort was also in communion with the Old Calendarists in 1973. Both Old Calendarist groups.
Mm-hmm.
So it works both ways. So tell me, if the Old Calendarists were schismatic heretics, like the official Greek position, ecumenical patriarch position was, is it acceptable for the ecumenical patriarchate, which is in communion with Jerusalem, which is in communion with Roquefort, which is in communion with the Old Calendarists, is that an acceptable situation? I mean, all it proves is that such situations happen. I mean, I don't really buy a lot of the communion line argument. I think that's somewhat of a caricature. I don't know if you agree with me or not, Father Joseph.
I would agree with you.
Sometimes you have cases in which people don't really understand what's going on. They're in communion with some bishop who's in communion with some bishop down the road who's in communion with somebody who's a heretic. A lot of that's due to communication. So it doesn't really bother me, because technically I could say the true Orthodox Church in Greece, if you're using the same logic, the true Orthodox Church in Greece in 73 was in communion with the Serbian Patriarchate, even though they technically, as far as I understand, they technically didn't serve with each other. But would you really say they're in communion? Only if you believe in what's called the mediated communion or something like that. So, I mean, I don't really see it as a big obstacle. I think it's something that has to be fixed and cleared up. However, the mechanisms that existed in church history for clearing and cleaning things up don't exist. And the mechanism, which people don't want to acknowledge, was the Orthodox imperial authority, which provided unity in the Orthodox Commonwealth. Now, that doesn't exist. There is no czar. So there will be, as far as I can understand, there will be no end to all these problems that are going to happen. That's my pessimistic view. So,
I try to take a more positive view. I'm looking at it from the perspective of time, and that is only because of the fact that 20 years ago, all of the true Orthodox synods that we're talking about, none of them were in communion with each other. Everyone was an island. And it was a really sad situation. There was a lot of anger, a lot of backbiting, a lot of really non-canonical reasons for being out of communion. That situation doesn't really exist today. Most of the true Orthodox in the world are in two separate communions. And, each one of them has parishes all over the world. No, well, now I do want to correct.
So Alexander is talking about Saint Hilary of Portiers and Auxentius of Milan, and that's a perfect case. Remember what happened to Saint Hilary of Portiers. Saint Hilary of Portiers knew the Auxentius of Milan was a heretic. He knew the man. Auxentius could claim he believed in the Nicene Creed as much as he wanted, and he could say he preached Christ was God from God. But Saint Hilary of Portiers said, frankly, I'm not going to have any communion with him or anything to do with him. And he told people to flee from him. And even in Italy, what happens is that I think they had 2 or 3 trials to discover whether he was really a heretic, and he would always exonerate himself by claiming the Nicene Creed, but then going back to preaching heresy. So eventually what happened in Italy was I think most of everybody cut off communion with Auxentius of Milan. because of how he was behaving and acting. But St. Hilary Portier said, in the meantime, what happens, he says, is that people would hear Auxentius of Milan preaching that Christ is God of God and light of light and begotten before the Father for all the ages. And the lay people in Milan would say, well, they would understand that how? They'd understand that in an Orthodox fashion. But Auxentius of Milan's fashion understanding was Arian. He would believe Christ is the created God from the uncreated God, the created light from the uncreated light, and begotten before the ages just meant he was created before the Lord created, God the Father created other things. So you would oftentimes have people who bishops who were heretics and were being separated from by other bishops, but who would preach in such a way that people weren't quite sure, or they would interpret their phrases and their words in Orthodox fashions. But St. Hilary Portier's point is this, is to, in his Contra Auxentium, is to warn people to dig deeper than just the exterior preachings they're hearing. And if St. Hilary Portier actually says, look, if the choice is between gathering in the basilica with these heretics and having no church and having to gather in your houses or in caves, go to the caves. So, okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So then, basically, well, I've been. Somebody asked me a question about the former Milan Synod, or what's left of it, and I was just explaining that for the most part. But what I was simply saying was that the situation as it is now is vastly different from the way it used to be, and so I hold out hope. I think that it's the fact that everyone is talking to each other is a huge difference. 20 years ago, if you were talking to, if I talked to members of another jurisdiction, it was because I was secretly planning to leave, or there was like it was crazy the level of
it was kind intrigue.
Yeah, there was so much palace intrigue, and now most of that's died. And
remember what St. Ambrose of Capua says. I mean, I'm not St. Ambrose says about at the Council of Capua. You can find in the letters of St. Ambrose. He says that when the representatives of the Meletian party and the Eustathian party came there, because St. Ambrose held a council to try to adjudicate between those parties, even the 380s, even after the Second Council. He said that all each could do was prove the others had a worse case than the other. They couldn't really make a positive case. He says that's all he heard. Now, he eventually simply granted communion to Evagrius, who was the successor to Paulinus, because that was just what, because the successor to Meletius, St. Flavian, actually didn't want to go there. And so he, Evagrius of Antioch, not Evagrius of Ponticus, won kind of by default. And even St. John Chrysostom, who had been ordained by St. Flavian, left St. Flavian at one point and got ordained by Evagrius, which is mentioned in the tripartite history, but it's not really, they don't really mention it in a lot of later lives, in the 20th century lives, because I think even the Wikipedia article, for some reason, says St. John Chrysostom was made a priest by Flavian, but if you look at the reference they give, it goes to Socrates' history, or Sisaminus, and it says St. John Chrysostom was ordained a priest by Evagrius after he left the Meletians. And then he later went back to the Meletians and such. But St. Ambrose's point is very valid, that all each side could do was prove, well, if you say this about me, I can say about you 3 things that are worse. And so on what kind of judgment can you make based upon that?
Well, I think that leads right into the question that Nathan asked, because he asked, what are the 2 largest true Orthodox jurisdictions and why are they separated? What's an obstacle to their union? Okay, well, there's a lot to unpack there. The first thing is that, first off, most of the jurisdiction of the 2 largest GOC communions are overlapping, which means that you're going to be talking about, even discussions would be happening on a multinational scale. The other thing I want to mention, and I know it sounds counter to my own position, is that, frankly, size should not matter. And I mean that because the simple reality is, if we look at like the Matthewites, for example, they're not in communion with anybody, but we're not going to say that they're not Orthodox. Well, maybe like the Kierikites, because they have some wacky views. But the point is that the regular Matthewites, by and large, they don't trust us. And so, therefore, we're not in communion with them. And their attitude would be very similar to what you see in the Meletian schism, where they would say, well, you need to be reordained. And we can say the same thing back, and everyone can say the same thing back to each other. But the point is, it's not about, who's most right. As you pointed out, Vladika, Really, I hate to say it, but it's really an argument over who's worse. And I think we generally accept. I like to say that we're the worst and we're the last chance you have to be Orthodox. But in any case, the point is that really you're not going to find. There's no ideal situation, and the most ideal situation is that you find a church that you're near, which is truer for most people than it was 20 years ago, but doesn't necessarily mean it's true now. Um, and just keep working towards building your own faith in your own life, and trying to attend and commune and follow the fasts, etc. I mean, the point is we still have to do what we're supposed to do, but it would we can make the biggest argument. It's kind of a silly argument because we're smaller in Greece than, say, if you want to talk, the two biggest jurisdictional communions would be ours, which would be the GOC under Metropolitan Angelos of Avlona, Metropolitan Seraphim of Moscow, Metropolitan John of New York, and all their attendant bishops in other countries, and then the GOC under Archbishop Kallinikos of Athens, the Russian Church abroad under Metropolitan Agafangel, and the TOCs of Bulgaria and Romania, which are in communion with each other as well. However, we have parishes in Bulgaria and Romania. Now, they're bigger over there in Bulgaria and Romania. We're bigger in Russia. No, we have parishes in the Philippines. The point is there's so much overlap going on that the question of who's bigger is not probably the best argument, especially since there are lots of true Orthodox who aren't in communion with anybody, and they're good people. We're not going to sit there and condemn them because they're trying to do the best that they can. And so that's, it's a confusing situation. And that's the sort of situation we live in. But, I can say, and I've said it many times over this show, if you think it's bad now, you should have seen us 20 years ago.
Well, let's go on. Other situations are going to happen. In Russia, of course, there's the Father Sergius Romanov, who is a Moscow patriarch. I think is an abbot of a monastery there in the Urals or something.
Yeah.
And the police are surrounding it, and he's got the Cossack militia there, and they don't know what's going to happen. Because remember, in Russia, in the Moscow Patriarchate, there's actually been this continuous low-key movement that's not reported outside of Russian religious news, where people are really upset, even in the Moscow Patriarchate, about closing down churches for the coronavirus stuff. And it's gotten to the point where many of them basically are non-committed. This Father Sergius Romanov has declared himself a non-commemorator. Now, in return, he had been saying kind of anti-ecumenical things a few years ago, especially after Crete, after the Havana Declaration, which really kind of gave new life into that in the MP. Now, never among the bishops, but among the lower clergy of some sort. And of course, then they brought up some issue where he had been arrested by the Soviets back in 1986 because he was involved in a car accident, and someone died in the car accident. He wasn't a monk or anything at the time. And then they later claimed, well, he never told us this, and he's guilty of murder and such. And, because you look at the Wikipedia article before all the controversy with him happened, is all very glowing, the Russian Wikipedia article. But then after he suddenly becomes persona non grata for condemning Kirill for ecumenism, they suddenly drag up every single piece of scandalous information they can find about him.
Yeah.
And his defenders will say, look, no, they're not reporting it correctly. But to a lot of people that, they don't control Russian Wikipedia. You can just, how the editors and the admins run those things. It's not really a free encyclopedia, as they say. But I mean, that's an example of what's going on in many of these other places where they're recapitulating.
You can even take that.
I mean, the only thing they're lacking at this point is they haven't been able to convince a bishop in the Moscow Patriarchate somewhere. I mean, there was Diomeda Chukotka, but that went crazy. But
it became an ancient worship. Yeah.
Exactly, and but that was 15 years ago or 6 or so, or something like that.
Wasn't there that new bishop who stopped commemorating?
You're thinking of Archbishop Longan in Ukraine. Yeah, and I don't know what happened with that. There was some sort of deal he made where supposedly he went back to commemorate the patriarch, but supposedly he's not now. But then he is now. He is the one that testified that he didn't feel any real change had been made by the patriarch, because he says that Kirill had presented the documents of the Synod of Crete to them and said there's nothing against orthodoxy in these and we should accept them. But actually, many MP bishops said if we do this, it's going to cause a massive schism in the Moscow Patriarchate.
Yeah.
Now, by massive, I don't think they meant like 50% of the clergy, but if you have 2 or 3% of their clergy get upset and become non-commemorators, that's
You've got a big problem on your hands.
Especially if these are more ultra conservatives and they're very dedicated about everything. If you can stand to lose 20% of time servers. You can't stand to lose almost 50% of your best people.
Yeah.
So now, if anyone's interested, they can always go to Longin's website. I don't know what it is, but you can probably find if you start searching the Russian internet. But my point is that they've not been able to quite go down that route yet because they haven't been able to find anybody. Because remember, people forget there was actually an initial wave of anti-Sergius non-commemorators. They were kind of the dissidents. They weren't necessarily they were kind of connected to the Catechism Church, but weren't quite connected to it. And they kind of, went under Rocor bishops in 1990, 89. And, that kind of, found its way out. But, we could stay here and talk about that for a long time, but, we've been here for some time anyway.
Now, Emil Surik writes, have to reject the argument that size is irrelevant. It's not the determining factor, but the idea that the true church, the ark of, I assume he means the ark of salvation, is reduced to a handful of people that has to be rejected unless it's the end time Sedevacantist style. I don't know that that's necessarily true. I mean, I once again, I have to point out that 20 years ago, all of the true Orthodox churches were disconnected. Now a lot of them are connected, and you were talking about millions of people. I don't know that I can just say, well, now that they've gotten together in communion, they're Orthodox. I think that's kind of crazy. I mean, we're living in crazy times, Emil, and the simple reality is, what are we talking about? We're talking about an abbot in the Moscow Patriarchate who's basically getting his life, turned upside down, much like Metropolitan Valentine of Suzdal did when he started the Free Russian Church. When he was, made it a first hierarch for it. I mean, he was a celebrity chef in Russia before, this happened. So, the point is,
there aren't a handful of people, by the way. I mean, if you're talking about like 1.5 million Romanian, that's really not a handful. I mean, especially that technically the numbers in Greece are like 500 to 800,000 people are considered old calendars. Now, which is interesting. Greece's population about 10.2, 10.3 million. And they claim 99% of the population is Orthodox. Well, how do they claim that if about 8% of the population is considered heretic schismatic? Well, it's because the New Calendar Church wants to claim even the people they claim are heretic schismatics are actually part of them when they're not. That's a whole other issue. So it's not true that you're talking about 20 people in Greece. You're talking about literally hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah,
in Romania, about 1 million.
We've seen that ourselves in Greece. I mean,
in Russia, over 1 million too.
Yeah. So these are, and that's just in our. I mean, that's in.
But my point is that this is not really a handful of people. It's not the Diamond Brothers, and that's something interesting. Where I had written that very preliminary article. It wasn't exhaustive about how the Supplices Terogamus clause in the Old Roman Canon was the original epiclesis of the Roman Canon. And you remember, we never got to talk about that, Father, but there were somebody in the comments on the that Roman Catholic liturgical site, liturgical renewal or whatever. Anyway,
I still have to write an article for NFTU on that because I don't know if our listeners. Well,
it was quite strange when they said that that we were like Most Holy Family Monastery. Well, first off, we don't have the money of Most Holy Family Monastery.
Yeah.
But secondly, we don't believe the same things. Obviously, that should be first. And additionally, I don't think anybody can. Most Holy Family Monastery is kind of like a priestless Sedevacantist group, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
Even most Sedevacantists haven't even gone that to the extent where they reject the priesthood. So I don't really think the handful of people argument. I mean, in America or Canada, you might say there's a handful of people here or there. But, I mean, that's a percentage of a percentage. Whereas in Greece, Romania, these other European countries, it's a little bit of a different case. If you live in Greece, you're not going to lack for finding an old calendar church somewhere, whether you like that or not. So,
I want to get to Nathan's question after I get finished with talking to Emil, because he does say, at best, the true Orthodox Church is part of the authentic church due to its orthodoxy, but to say the true church is limited to the true orthodoxy is, again, to make the Sedevacantist case and time. Well, we're not making the Sedevacantist case. We're simply saying basic argument that we follow true bishops and that certain bishops we don't respect, such as the ecumenical patriarch, which seems to be the position of increasingly almost everybody. But the point is that just because we got to that conclusion first doesn't necessarily mean we're going to condemn people who get to that conclusion later. We're not making that. It's not our proficiency to make that judgment. We're like, for example, this would be a better argument if you're talking about Greece, where you have, archbishops and bishops of the TOCs making the claim against the new calendar. But here, it's a completely disconnected situation. I don't know that, for me personally, I'm in, Northeast Pennsylvania, where I can see domes of churches everywhere. But if you go down to, say, the middle of, the deep South, or you go into the Midwest, you're not going to see an Orthodox church driving 10 hours. So I don't know that we're not that big here, but neither is anyone else. So it just doesn't make sense.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I still don't believe Emil Surik's point is that great, because look, I mean, you've had time in church history in which, again, after Honorius died, and you had John VIII, but especially at the time you get to Pope St. Theodore and Pope St. Martin. At the Lateran Synod, Pope St. Martin essentially saying that the Eastern Patriarchates have apostatized into the heresy schism of monothelitism, which basically means he's claiming that 80+%, if not more, because remember the Eastern population was much greater than the West after the Great Plagues and the 500s. He's essentially claiming that his patriarchate, which was maybe 15% of the population, was the real Orthodox Church. Which is why they gave Stephen of Joppa the authority to go consecrating bishops throughout Palestine and Syria, and such. So, I mean, even in those cases, you're claiming, 5, 10, 15% is the real church. It's 5%, 10%, 15. That's still not a handful. Handful of people.
It's not a small number.
It's not a small.
It's not Diamond Brothers level by any means.
It's not 3 people, and that's it. It's not 20 people, and that's it. It's not 100 people, and that's it.
Yeah,
it's not even 1,000 people. It's not it.
Once you're talking about, in the thousands and millions, you're no longer talking about some tiny little body. You're talking about a lot of people. And as I said, again, we don't know what's going to happen with the people in the patriarchates as things continue to get worse. This virus showed a lot of people a lot of things about, the endemic corruption that, we've been decrying for years, and now other people are. And so I think that's I wouldn't.
Anyway, I'm just saying it's now we could be closer to the end times. We're always closer to the end times than the previous year. So I'm not going to discount that. Certainly there's been Russian saints and new martyrs that have talked about how the time of the end times draws near. So, I'm not going to say they're crazies. So
yeah. Well, the Diamond Brothers, I think they're kind of crazy.
Well, the Russian saints aren't crazy.
Oh no, the Russian saints aren't crazy, and we're always supposed to. It's been the end times since the founding of the church. So it's as simple as that. We're going to head to apocalypse one way or another, and I didn't want to talk about that too much, but the truth of the matter is we should be vigilant towards the end. We don't know.
Also, you should be prepared for the end, but plan for the future.
Exactly, and so I think that covers. Oh, I did want to cover Nathan's question real quick because we missed that. Why has the MP Kirill so pointedly condemned the EP's ecumenism with Rome? What are the MP's ecumenist activities that make them less than true Orthodox? Well, we mentioned the Havana Declaration, which actually enraged a lot of people in Russia because he basically secretly met with the Pope and had an agreement that they made in Cuba.
Well, the agreement was made public, though.
Yeah, the agreement was made public afterwards, and that's what I think.
Sorry for interrupting you, Father, but please. I just have to make the point that this wasn't just him meeting, Frank for a beer or something like that. Yeah. It wasn't just a meet and greet. They were signing a declaration where they were declaring each other to be brothers in Christ.
Yeah.
Well, if the Pope is the head of the heretical papist organization, and you're claiming to be the patriarch of the Orthodox Church of Russia, how can you confess that this man is your brother in Christ? He's not. And this is what, in fact, enraged so many people. True Orthodox, we were already there. But this, like you said,
enraged people in the patriarchate itself.
Exactly. Who simply sees commemoration over this. So, I mean, now there are interestingly people in interestingly people in the Patriarchate that have continuously criticized Kirill for, I don't know what, since he's been patriarch. Like the Blagogan.ru people, for example, but they also are into this crazy Soviet Orthodoxy paradigm. It's very strange where they claim to be like ultra conservatives, but the Soviet Union was really great, and so it's very odd. But the other stuff, look, they just had the 4-year anniversary of the Havana Declaration where they sent Hilarion Alfeyev over to Rome. So, I mean, the problem is this: if it's just a non-dogmatic issue, if there are no dogmatic issues being addressed, if ecumenism is just being nice to your neighbor, well, you're right. There would be no reason to cease commemoration, but that's not what it is, and people historically have understood that.
Yeah,
a schism is when you just break and you have the same. If someone ceases commemoration of Patriarch Kirill, and they say, "I believe the exact same things as Patriarch Kirill, and I just don't like the fact that he wore this expensive watch," okay, which he did. That would be stupid, and you'd be a schismatic if that's the only problems going on.
Yeah.
But if you cease commemoration because he's teaching things contrary to the Holy Fathers and the councils, then that's not schism. In fact, the Canon 15 says you preserve yourself from schism, which is separation from the body of Christ, by ceasing commemoration of false shepherds and false bishops.
Which leads to Emil's last question here, because we're going to go soon. Yes, the wolves have shown their true colors. The question is schism the right answer? If they're wolves, it's not schism. That's the point.
Now, of course, the question presumes that schism. No, of course, schism's not the right answer. But what's happening is not schism. Schism is when you break with the church and you have no dogmatic, and a plain schismatic, according to Saint Basil. I don't know why people are avoiding Saint Basil's categorizations, because that's where we derive these things from.
Yeah, exactly.
A plain schismatic, according to Saint Basil, is someone who breaks with the church, but they believe the exact same things as the bishops they break with. There's no doctrinal difference. I mean, it's like claiming I could go to, I don't know, Demetrius or Elephant Man. What's the word?
Elpidoporus.
Elephant Man. Okay, so I could go to him, and I could claim I believe the exact same things as he believes, or I could go to in his Fordham Club. Well, that would be absolutely ridiculous. So we don't believe the same things. Well, then the other categorization is what? Well, you can be a schismatic heretic. Well, then that brings in the issue of dogma. So who is a schismatic heretic then? Is it the one who teaches things contrary to the Orthodox fathers and councils and saints, or is it the one who affirms those things?
Yeah.
So if you affirm the teachings of the fathers, then you cannot commemorate people who are preaching against those things. So how that works out, you're right. Canon, and I've said this many times, Canon 15 does not provide an elaborate, laid out circumstances of how to restore and reform synods. You have to look at historical precedent for that, and we've gone over that a few times before. So you're right. Someone can say, well, Canon 15 doesn't say, you have to go about consecrating new bishops. Well, it does say you can't be under false bishops.
Right, and I'd like to point this out, because I think a lot of people do not quite understand how this works. Canon 15 does not say you have to form a new hierarchy. It says you have to go to true bishops, and that's all we did when we came into Orthodoxy. The point is, if you have bishops who are teaching falsehood and you have bishops who are teaching truth, you're supposed to go to the bishops who are teaching truth. It's very simple as a layperson. There's not like, you don't have to form your own organization or anything like that. You just have to join true bishops.
Now, remember, this oftentimes is what happens. For example, when Nestorius began to initially, through his chaplain Anastasius, preach that Our Lady was not Theotokos, but they preached she was Christotokos. What happens in Constantinople is that people leave the church, literally leave the church building, not the church, and they can't stand that. And then the other archimandrites, the abbots of the monasteries and other churches, eventually stop commemorating Nestorius. And then they write letters to who? They write letters to Patriarch St. Kirill. Because the first step, is to try to get this situation resolved. Now, in the case of that issue, it was resolved very relatively fast. Within I think a year after the first preaching of heresy, you had the Third Ecumenical Council transpire. And hopefully that's how things can, come about. There's someone preaching heresy from the pulpit, that's been condemned by the fathers, it's against the saints, etc. You cease commemoration. Maybe you go and warn him and say, look, Vladika, you have to stop this, and he is still adamant about it. Then a man who is a heretic after the first or second admonition, I believe the apostle says, you cut off. And then you ask other bishops to take action. The whole purpose of Canon 15 was to preserve people from being locked into kind of this idea where, the bishop can just teach whatever he wants, and you have no choice. It was also to prevent, by the way, and this goes back to somewhat my disagreements with Father Theodore's book, it was also to prevent issues where people simply just break communion over non-dogmatic issues. The second council.
First second.
So, I mean...
Now, it's worth noting, and I always have to, it's always important to qualify this, because we want to be very clear. Canon 14 of the First Second Council specifically says that anyone who breaks from the divine mystagogy of the Patriarch without sufficient reason is to be condemned. We do not disagree with this, but Canon 15 allows for the one case in which that is possible, and that's heresy. And so the point is, if that's what we're dealing with, that's what you got to do.
Which is why I find it strange that Father Theodore's book made all these other cases. Because oftentimes I've encountered people who try, if you believe your bishop is just, a bad man, or you don't like him, that's not a case for breaking communion. If he's a heretic, that's a case.
Now, this is now All the Stars Are Dead says, can you infallibly say the world Orthodox sacraments are invalid, or is the teaching of the Orthodox Church that Christians are not to regard them invalid, but they are not infallibly invalid? I've read many true Orthodox sources saying there are no sacraments outside the Church, and I don't understand the teaching. If I may on this, I just want to throw something out here on this one, Flavica. The first thing to remember on that question is that that is a basic Orthodox teaching. We did not make that up in 1920. That's been the teaching of the Church for all time. So that's something that when the split in Greece first occurred, for example, and the old calendarists got bishops, the first thing the New Calendar Church of Greece said is, your sacraments are invalid. And so they immediately responded with, your sacraments are invalid, because that is, you can't get around that. That's just an Orthodox teaching. That's not specifically true.
As far as I understand, all true Orthodox jurisdictions have come to that conclusion now. They do teach that position. Now, initially, I can tell you it wasn't the case, because even in the case of Greece you mentioned, when the three bishops formed the synod back in 35, Metron Chrysostomos of Florina, who wasn't technically the leader, I think it was Demetrius was technically he was the leader, the first hierarch. Chrysostomos of Florina basically gave a series of interviews, or at least one or two interviews, to an Athenian newspaper, and he says, well, they're potential schismatics and they're not actual schismatics. So that became an issue where many of the old calendarists did not want to say the new calendarists were actually deprived of the grace of the mysteries, and that in fact caused 10% of them to break away from the main group over that. And I mean, that continued up into, I think, the 70s, in which there were still continuous disputes over that.
But it's worth noting that
my point about that was that it was, my only point was that it wasn't like a kind of a feathery conclusion. Oh, we just want to on a whim make this statement. It was something like 7 years of controversy among people who called themselves or called calendarists to even come to that conclusion, because people didn't want to say it, but they felt compelled after a time to say it. I'm sorry, Father.
Yeah, well, no. Also, I was just going to add, because when you say world Orthodoxy, you have to realize that Orthodoxy is not a monolith, and so when the old calendarists in Greece declared the mysteries of the new calendarist schismatic, they weren't declaring the OCA schismatic, for example. They were specifically dealing with Greece, and then Russia had its own. They were specifically dealing with Russia, and so in the 70s, when Rokor was in communion with all the sets of the Greek old calendarists, they were also in communion with Jerusalem, and that itself was an issue, but even Jerusalem, under Patriarch Diodorus, was communing old calendarists.
Well, remember, this is one of the strange occurrences that when the three hierarchs officially left the state church and they formed the old calendar hierarchy, or reformed it rather, a statement was put out by them almost immediately after that, before they had a confession of faith or any of that other stuff, in which they said that they wanted to cooperate with all the patriarchates that still adhere to the patristic tradition, including Russia, Poland, Serbia,
Jerusalem, Antioch,
etc. Now, That's interesting because it actually brings up the interesting question, which is getting too late here, about what do they even know was even happening in Russia, for example. I mean, and why do they even mention Poland? Because technically Poland had been given autocephaly in 1924 by the Ecumenical Patriarchate or something like that.
Yeah.
So it seemed like they were even having a situation where they were concerned that, well, I guess the Poles are all right, but the Ecumenical Patriarchate's not. I mean, and that's been subject to a great deal of discussion. And we could probably just go on and on and on here for another hour about all this stuff. So,
yeah. So I mean, ultimately, that's the tricky part is, it's yeah, and I see that, Sean points out we don't admit any grace whatsoever in World Orthodoxy, and once again, that's not the view that's been consistently held. None of us have held that view consistently over the past century. It's just not real. It's even Metropolitan Saint Chrysostom of Florina himself vacillated on the issue, which is what caused the formation of the Matthewite Synod. So I mean, we've got to approach all of these things as, I hate to say this, as clearly as possible, and it's tricky. It's tricky because it's a messy history, and it's still messy because, as I said,
well remember, if you're speaking in terms of historicity, yes, but if you're talking about current positions, it's quite different now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So like if someone says, "What is your current position?" That's different than saying, "What was the battle that happened to come to this conclusion?"
Right.
All right. And the only reason I bring that up is you have to be honest, because otherwise people are going to read the history and say, well, these bishops said this, and the Roquefort bishops in the 60s and 70s and didn't. For example, you can find out there was the whole controversy back in 74, where the Matthewites, who were technically in communion with Roquefort at the time, they sent in a letter, and you can, I guess if you search, you can find this. I think the old Stavros Marcus site used to have it.
Yeah.
In which they asked what was the position of Roquefort, one of the patriarchates. And the Matthewite position was that they don't have grace. And the Roquefort position was stated something like, well, we don't believe we have the authority to say that, although we support the old calendar churches, kind of the middling,
position. Yeah.
Well, I mean, to be honest, to call it Cyprianite.
Yeah, well, Cyprianite was so nuanced.
Cyprianite's more than simply saying that, because otherwise you'd have to confess the Russian church was Cyprianite in 1905 when they wrote their reply to Joachim III, because of things they said in that are probably much more extreme than the Cyprianite position. And again, that's a whole other issue about that what went on there. But I think Sean is right. This is the current position. We've had to come to these conclusions. It's taken decades. Oftentimes people did not want this. It wasn't like everybody was rejoicing in saying this.
Yeah.
And the center could not hold, because if you hold a position where you want to kind of be friends with everybody, then you're not going to end up being friends with anybody. I don't know what more to say, but I think we've gone on with this. So,
yeah. Now Nathan does ask, what do you think of the claim that it would take something like an ecumenical council to affirm that world orthodoxy is graceless? I think the key here is because people get too caught up on the question of grace and not caught enough on the question of orthodoxy. If we're claiming gracelessness because of heresy, then really the question needs to be focused on heresy. Because if we're focusing, otherwise then it becomes because this is what I do remember that, Sean. I see that you're speaking of the 35 encyclical, which was reaffirmed in 1950. I'm fully aware of this. But what I am saying is I'm a witness 20 years ago to where we stopped saying the world Orthodox have no grace, and we started saying, you know what? You guys don't have grace either, and you guys don't have grace either, and you guys don't have grace. And what happens is it becomes a race to the bottom where everybody is looking for condemnations of each other. The point is, if heresy is present, you reject heresy. If the patriarchates are in heresy, you reject them. If true Orthodox churches fall to heresy, you reject them. It's about heresy. And people are so concerned about the grace question, they're forgetting that if you're a heretic, you're outside the church.
Okay, but by the way, I still don't believe the argument that only an ecumenical council can affirm. By world orthodoxy, they really mean a large portion of patriarchate or a local church.
Right.
Because remember, there were two local councils, actually 3 or 4, over a period of 40 years in Rome, that condemned the iconoclast as, in fact, the Lateran Synod in 769. There's another Lateran Synod that simply reconfirmed the previous decision from 731, which considered Constantinople to be iconoclast, heretic, schismatics. So, I mean, they didn't believe that only an ecumenical council had that authority. So, I mean, for example, there was no ecumenical council that was held that condemned the Donatists. Right. Everybody simply just began to break communion with them because of how crazy they were. So, you know, that's if you want to get into the Cyprian issue, that's more, I think, the Cyprianite issue when you start getting into only an ecumenical council can declare somebody graceless. Now, technically, Canon 15 of the First Second Synod really only deals with bishops, by the way. I know they asked about a priest. It doesn't. I don't know why it doesn't deal with a priest. Probably because you can simply leave and go to another parish or whatever. Or
go to a different priest, and you report him to the bishop.
And you get to report him because technically a priest is under the direct authority of the bishop. Whereas a bishop, even though he's subject to his metropolitan, if he's a ruling bishop, the metropolitan isn't a dictator, if you know what I mean. Metropolitan does not relate to another ruling bishop in his province the same way that ruling bishop relates to a priest under him.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a much easier thing to deal with. And if he's preaching publicly heresy, and I'd say admonish him, and then don't go to him anymore, and then report him to the bishop. That's the simplest way to do that. So,
we're at 2 hours.
Yeah, this is longer than I wanted to go.
Yeah, it's a lot longer, but that's okay. I guess this will cover for the week. We're going to try to break up into shorter episodes starting next week, so we're only doing an hour, but we'll do them more often. But this one went way over time, guys. We really appreciate everybody listening. Again, if you haven't, like, share, subscribe. We'll continue talking. We'll continue doing this and keep answering questions. But we're gonna cut off for now. I hope everyone is having a productive fast, and we're gonna say goodbye for now, and we'll be back. Benedicite.
Benedicite.